What are the consequences of not believing in objective morality? I think a lot of times when people ask this question, they're wondering specifically about the behavioral consequences of not believing in objective morality. After all, if someone doesn't believe in an objective, mind independent standard of right and wrong, what's to stop him from doing whatever he wants? Without an objective standard, all we have to guide us in our moral actions are our own personal, subjective senses of morality. And if one person's subjective feeling of right and wrong tells him that, say, robbing banks is okay, then the argument goes, there's nothing to stop him from robbing banks. And then it's asked, if everyone lives like this, just following their own personal senses of right and wrong, how could we ever get along with each other and live in a society? Without a shared objective standard in good and evil that we can all refer to, what's to stop us from doing terrible things to each other? Since we have no way to actually know and arbitrate which things are terrible and which things aren't. I think these are good, worthwhile concerns that need to be engaged with. But in this video, I want to talk about a different question, one that really doesn't get as much attention. This question is a bit more abstract than talking about how not believing in objective morality might change the way people act. But I think it's an extremely important one, and if an answer to it isn't found soon, it could result in us losing something even more important to a well-functioning society than good behavior. The question I want to ask is this: how can we deny objective morality without falling into skepticism? How can we deny that objective moral values exist without ultimately being forced to conclude that nothing exists at all? Like I said, this is a pretty abstract question, but I hope you can see why it's an important one. If it really is the case that you can't deny objective morality without falling into skepticism about things like the existence of the physical world, the existence of other human beings, or even the existence of yourself as a self, then we have strong reasons not to accept the belief that there are no objective moral facts, also known as moral anti-realism. After all, radical skepticism about things so basic to our experience could undermine all of human knowledge. If we can't trust, for example, that the material world even exists, then we can't trust that the knowledge we get from observing the physical world is reliable. That would cast doubt on all the findings of science, which are discoverable only through observation of the physical world. It would also make life totally unlivable, because we would have no way of knowing if the people we're talking to really exist or not, or if, say, the food we're eating for dinner is actually an illusion, or if any number of strange, skeptical scenarios which would make all of your actions meaningless are true. So, if it really is the case that denying objective morality leads to this kind of radical skepticism, then we have really big problems. The kind of problems that should convince us that moral anti-realism just isn't a viable position. But why would anyone think that moral anti-realism might lead to this kind of skepticism? Well, one thing that I've been thinking a lot about recently is that in order to avoid skepticism, we need to be really careful to articulate a good epistemological theory, or a theory of how we know things. After all of the most famous skeptical philosophers in history became skeptics because of their theory of knowledge, their epistemology. Take René Descartes, for example. Quite famously, Descartes decided to begin his philosophy with the assumption that everything is equally open to being doubted, no matter how basic it might appear on the surface. This led him to the conclusion that the only things that we really have direct knowledge of are ourselves and our ideas. That in turn forced Descartes to believe that we can only know that the world outside of ourselves exists by a kind of faith in God, an all-good God, who wouldn't deceive us on a matter so fundamental in our lives. Later philosophers would take Descartes' skepticism to an even greater extreme. Using the same epistemological standard as Descartes, the 18th century philosopher George Berkeley concluded that we have absolutely no way of knowing if the material world even exists, and said that all we can know to exist is ourselves and God. So Berkeley was even more skeptical than Descartes. And this conclusion that he arrived at, that we can know only that we exist and that God exists, was in turn doubted by David Hume, who, again, using the same epistemological starting point as Descartes and Berkeley, concluded that we can't even know if there is such a thing as a self or as a God. As these examples show, the history of philosophy from Descartes onward was the slow working out of the problems that follow from adopting a standard of knowledge that subjects everything to the same universal high bar of truth. If everything can be equally doubted, then we can end up in skepticism about super basic things which are so important for living a functional life, as the tradition of post-Cartesian philosophy demonstrates. Now, perhaps some of you may want to disagree with me on this, but I see this fact about the history of philosophy and the history of philosophy after Descartes especially as reason enough to rethink any epistemological standard which, like Descartes, makes everything equally subject to doubt. If a certain theory of knowledge makes it possible for me to say that I don't exist or that my family members don't exist, then there must be something wrong with that theory. For that reason, I think we really need to take as our starting point some kind of theory of knowledge which doesn't say that every idea can be doubted to the same extent. In particular, we really need to have an epistemological theory which gives extra credence to ideas like the existence of the physical world, or of the self, or of other people. Ideas, in other words, which are supported by common human experience and intuition. Now, I don't think we necessarily have to say that we can never doubt things supported by common human experience and intuition. I just think it's important that we don't hold things supported by common experience to the exact same bar of truth as more unintuitive ideas. We could, for example, say something like an idea supported by common human experience should be treated as innocent until proven guilty, but an idea that's unintuitive and not supported by common human experience should be treated more like it's guilty until proven innocent, or at least not treated as innocent until proven guilty. So we're giving more credence, we're giving more leeway to ideas which are supported to common experience without outright assuming they're true. This would still make it possible for us to disprove intuitive ideas if there's a strong degree of evidence against them. But it would also help us to avoid much of the radical skepticism that consumed modern philosophy after Descartes. Okay, so now we have a good epistemological standard that'll let us avoid radical skepticism. How does this apply to objective morality? Well, what I want to suggest here is that moral realism, or the position that objective moral facts exist, is an idea supported by common human intuition, like the idea that ourselves exist or that other human people exist. It should therefore be treated as innocent until proven guilty, given the standard we laid out above. As evidence of this claim, look at the prominence of moral debates about moral topics through all times and places. Certainly, many people, for one reason or another, may not be personally inclined to engage in moral debates. But it's extremely rare for someone to object to the notion of debating moral topics entirely, and to suggest that there is nothing fruitful about moral debates by their very nature. Moral debates can be found everywhere, from political campaigns to living room conversations. Yet there's no anti-moral debating movement pushing back against this trend at all. And calling it a trend is even kind of loose because it's just so universal. People like to debate moral subjects. And again, it's common for some individuals not to think that a particular topic is worth debating. Like, it's not worth debating what to have for dinner tonight. That's not a moral debate that you really have to be invested in. But that's not the same thing as saying that there's nothing of value in the entire practice of moral debating per se, or of saying that there are no topics which are worth debating, which no one does. No one says that. But if most people think that moral claims are at least in principle worth challenging on the basis of facts and evidence, it follows necessarily that most people at least implicitly accept that moral claims are factual, and that objective moral facts therefore exist. As more evidence for this conclusion, think about how we punish people for bad behavior, and we reward them for good behavior. If someone robs a bank, we put him in a prison, and we feed him tasteless food. But if someone saves a baby from a burning building, on the other hand, we give him medals and we applaud him as a hero. If we didn't believe that some actions were inherently more praiseworthy and blameworthy than others, then these practices just wouldn't make any sense. The fact that we do things like this, then, shows that we have an implicit, intuitive belief in moral realism. We implicitly believe that there are objective moral facts. But if that's the case, then the epistemological standard that we said earlier was needed to avoid skepticism demands that we treat moral realism as innocent until proven guilty. But it's that's the case, in the absence of good arguments against moral realism, we should conclude that moral realism is true. Now, there are arguments that have been given against moral realism, and they're definitely worth engaging with. But to get into that discussion now would take us a little far afield for this video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say now that I will come back to this subject in the future. I will come back to the arguments that have been proposed against moral realism. So if you want to stay tuned in for when those videos come out, please consider subscribing to this channel to get notified. For now, though, what I really want to do is just kind of fully draw out and draw attention to this connection between moral realism and radical skepticism. Remember, we said that in order to avoid skepticism, we have to adopt an epistemological standard that gives extra credence to common human intuition. But as we just said, common human intuition supports moral realism. Therefore, in order to avoid skepticism, we have to give extra credence to moral realism. To say this in a different way, in the absence of a strong case against moral realism, we can't doubt moral realism without also casting doubt on equally basic ideas, like the existence of the physical world, the self, or other people. In other words, it's not enough to say we don't know if morality is objective to take a skeptical approach to objective morality. If you don't have a strong case against moral realism, you should assume that it's true, for the same reason that you should assume that the world outside of you exists, or that your next door neighbor exists, without a strong case against that position. That, at least, is my claim. Maybe you're skeptical on some parts of it. That's okay, and that's actually a really good thing. There's nothing better than a good dialogue on these kind of questions. Now, before I sign off on this video, I want to mention one more thing. I think that the topic of moral realism is interesting in its own right, but I think it becomes even more interesting when put in the context of the question of how a belief in moral realism might require the existence of God. Because of this, next week, or whenever I release my next video, I will make a video on the moral argument for God's existence, starting with moral realism and showing how there is actually a really strong case that moral realism might entail the existence of God, stronger even than some people think. This is an argument I've come up with fairly recently. So if you want to get tuned in when that video comes out, please consider subscribing to this channel for notifications. Regardless of what you do with that, I hope you have enjoyed watching this video. Thank you, and God bless.